All right, well, I'm glad you're here today. Before I jump into anything else, there is an important piece of business that we need to deal with, which is that today is Super Bowl Sunday, and the Bengals are in the Super Bowl. I don't know what to do with that, but I'm excited. So I thought I'd share my joy with you. There are some of you in the crowd, I won't mention names, who have shirts on that say things along the lines of "not a Bengals fan." I'm just saddened by that. Hey, so today we're kicking off a brand new message series, and I'm very excited about it. This is a series that I've had in my heart for a long time. It's called The GOAT, and if you're not a sports fan, you may not know kind of what that acronym stands for. The GOAT is an acronym for the greatest of all time, the greatest of all time. And this series, throughout this series, what we're going to do is we're going to look at one biblical character who I think is the greatest biblical character outside of Jesus. So if you're familiar with the Bible, if you've been in church like at all in your life, you probably would guess if I said, hey, who do you think is probably the most developed, talked about person in the Bible? The obvious answer is Jesus, right? And that is true. But do you know who the second most developed, talked about, the person that like the most time is spent on in the Bible? The answer is David. David was a man that shows up in the Old Testament, which is the earlier part of the Bible. And if you're familiar with the story of David and Goliath, it would be that David. But the story of David is much deeper than him killing a giant. In fact, it is one of the most, it is the most inspiring, encouraging, challenging. It's just, man, the story of David is incredible. And so I called this series The GOAT, the greatest of all time, because as far as people go, in my mind, there's a reason that maybe we would look at David like he's the greatest human of all time. And I'm going to talk about why I kind of say that here in a moment as we get into our story today. But today is going to be a little bit different than the way I normally preach. Typically, if you've been here before, you know that normally I'll have a couple scriptures. We'll have like a couple like fill in the blank kind of things. And today we're doing like a ton of Bible, like a lot. So we're going to jump in pretty quick, and there's no fill in the blanks. I did leave some blanks in there, but here's what I want to do that's different today, and we're going to kind of just take a little bit of a different approach through this series in general. I didn't want to take this giant story that we're going to look at today and reduce it down to like a here's what you need to know or a here's what you need to do. I didn't feel right about that. This story is complex and it's deep and it's real and it's powerful. And so what I wanted to be able to do was leave room for you to listen to the leading of the Holy Spirit and write down whatever it is that sticks out to you, whatever it is that you feel like God puts on your heart as I talk through today. So if you look at your notes, what you have is there will be like, there's a couple of scripture references. I'm going to read all of those out loud. They're going to be on the screen behind me. And then there will be there's like a grouping of them and then some blanks. Just write down whatever you feel led to if you want to do that. That's it. So with that in mind, I'd actually like to pray as we get started. And I'm going to pray for something very specific. So let me do that, and we're going to jump right in today, okay? Father, thank you for today. Thank you for your word. Thank you for the scriptures that paint this, the most incredible pictures, that tell us the most incredible stories, all of which leads us back to our King, to you. And so, Father, today as we look at the beginnings of two kings, Father, speak to us. For every one of us, tune our hearts to your voice. Help us to hear what it is you have for us today. We love you. Amen. All right, so today we are going to be talking about David. But before we actually dive into David's narrative, there's some really important backstory to the story of David. We're going to spend several weeks in David's story. To be honest with you, I don't even have an end date on this series yet. I mean, we're going to be in it like probably 5 or 6 weeks. But before we jump into the meat of David's story, we've got to spend some time talking about how this guy became someone that we're talking about today. So we're going to back all the way up to 1 Samuel chapter 8. 1 Samuel chapter 8. 1 Samuel is a book in the Old Testament of the Bible. It's a really cool book, and it's written by a man named Samuel, hence 1 Samuel. Samuel was a judge. Now, this was not a judge in the way you think about a judge today. The judges were people who, in this particular period of the nation of Israel, they were the rulers of the nation of Israel. So they settled disputes. That you might think that's similar to what a judge does today. They would handle disputes. They would handle any kind of issues between people. They were then they also sort of served in this role of they would hear from God. So they served in a role of prophet as well. They would hear from God, and then they would deliver messages to the nation of Israel on God's behalf. So the judges were very important. They were the most powerful people in Israel. And Samuel is the last in the line of the judges. Samuel has 2 sons, and they're wicked. They're evil. They're awful. And like everybody knows it. So Samuel at this time is kind of the top dog in the nation of Israel, but his sons are awful. And so the nation of Israel begins to cry out to God kind of collectively for a king. They want a king. They don't want the judges anymore. They want a king. And they definitely don't want Samuel's sons. They want a king. Well, this is a problem because earlier in the history of the nation of Israel, God had established himself as the king of the nation of Israel. His plan was that they would never have a king like all the surrounding nations and tribes. But Israel goes to God and they're like, we want a king. We want a king. We want a king. We want to be like the people around us. So God gives Samuel a message. And the message that he gives for Samuel to give to the people is, you don't really want a king. You think you do. But if you get a king, what's going to happen is at some point in time, the king is going to become wicked. And he's going to enslave you. He's going to take your sons and your daughters and make them into slaves. And it's not going to go how you think. But if that's what you are so set on, okay. So Samuel gives this message to the nation of Israel, and they go, we don't care, we want a king. So God gives them a king. In 1 Samuel 9, we're introduced to the very first king in the history of the nation of Israel. So God speaks to Samuel and he says, hey, about this time tomorrow, there's going to be a guy that comes up to you out of nowhere, and he's going to be the one that I want you to anoint king of Israel. Samuel says, okay. About that time the next day, there's a guy who had been in town looking for donkeys. He was the son of a man named Kish, a wealthy landowner. Some of Kish's donkeys had escaped, so his son was trying to find them. They can't find the donkeys, and his servant says, hey, there's a seer, there's a prophet in this town who might be able to help us. We should go find him. And the son says, okay. So they go find the prophet. It so happens to be Samuel. This man walks up to Samuel, and God says, that's him, that's the king. So Samuel begins to tell this guy, hey, God is going to use your family to impact the entire nation, to impact all of us, all of our people. You're going to lead them. And in this introduction to this character, we see an interesting thing about his personality at this point. So 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 21. The man's name is Saul. And he answers Samuel when Samuel tells him this. He says, but I'm not a Benjamite. I'm from the smallest tribe of Israel. And is not my clan the least of all the clans in the tribe of Benjamin? Why do you say such a thing to me? He says, listen, why are you telling me my family is going to do great things when we're from the least tribe and we're the least clan in the tribe? We're nothing. It's an interesting introduction to Saul. Because at the time at which God chooses Saul to be king, Saul displays a heart of humility. He displays in his character that he doesn't think highly of himself. In fact, a little bit later, Samuel gives Saul some instructions, and he says, I want you to leave here, and I want you to go to this place. By the way, your donkeys, they're there, so you'll find them. Don't worry about it. He says, go to this place, you'll find your donkeys. Then go to this place, then go to this place. When you get there, wait. Just wait on me. Don't do anything yet. And in the meantime, Samuel gathers the entire assembly of the nation of Israel. He gathers them in one place, and he begins to tell them, you asked for a king, God is giving you a king. In fact, we're gonna cast lots. You can think of casting lots as like drawing straws. So Samuel already knows who God has anointed king. But he knows if he just says it, it may not hold the weight that he wants. So he turns it over to God by them essentially drawing straws for who's going to be king. Doesn't that sound like a great way to pick a ruler? Now Samuel does this trusting that God's got the straws in control. And so as they begin to cast lots, the tribe of Benjamin, they start with the tribes. The tribe of Benjamin is chosen. And then they begin to cast lots within the tribe of Benjamin, all the different clans. And the clan that Saul belongs to is chosen. And finally, they begin to cast lots over all the different members of the clan, and it comes to Saul. And when the lots finally are cast and the king is chosen, everybody looks around. And here's what happens. Finally, Saul of Kish was taken, but when they looked for him, he was not to be found. So they inquired further of the Lord, has the man come here yet? And the Lord said, yes, he has hidden himself among the supplies. So there's a ceremony where they're about to anoint the king. And the man who is chosen as the king is hiding among boxes. Not a great start, probably. I included that verse because, again, we see this like he's not really all that interested in all this attention. I mean, some people would be like, all right, where's my army? And Saul's back in the boxes like, maybe they won't see me. So they ran and they brought him out. And as soon as he stood among the people, this is an interesting little tidbit, he was a head taller than any others. As a little bit of a side note, if you're ever spending time reading the Bible and there's like a seemingly random, insignificant detail, it's probably not random and insignificant. In fact, this phrase, he was a head taller than any of the others, it recurs a couple different times in the early part of Saul's story. It's a metaphor. I mean, he probably was a head taller than everyone else. But often in ancient Jewish literature, they would write physical traits to symbolize internal character traits. And so at this point in the narrative, here's what we know. Israel's asked for a king. God says, you don't really want a king. They say, yes, we do. God says, okay. If you have kids, you ever let your kids do something that you knew was dumb, but you let them do it because you knew they needed to learn? Like, this is what's happening right now. So God's like, listen, you don't actually want this. Yes, we do. Okay. You made your bed. You're going to lay in it. So God goes to Samuel, anoints this king. To this point in the narrative, it appears that Saul is humble. It appears that Saul doesn't want the spotlight. It appears that he's not prideful. It appears that he has qualities and characteristics that are going to make him a great king, which is probably why God chose him to start with. But then there's this detail. He was a head taller than all the others. And as the narrative progresses, what you begin to see is that this physically imposing figure, who at the time doesn't think very highly of himself, begins to think more and more highly of himself over time. And it's his downfall in the end. So, Saul's anointed king. After he's anointed king, he goes and continues the journey that Samuel had laid out for him. And as he does, a couple different things happen. He lands his first battle against the Ammonites, and he wins, which is a great start. The people who initially, when Saul is given the title, when he's anointed king, a lot of the people in the nation of Israel, they don't like it. They don't think he's impressive. They don't want him as the king. But he wins a great battle, and so people begin to say, okay, maybe this guy's going to turn out okay. In the midst of it, Samuel, the judge, the prophet, Samuel retires. Now, I don't know how you retire from being the main prophet in the nation of Israel, but he does. He just kind of goes into hiding. It's like, I'm done. I got the king. We took care of it. I'm out. Then Saul wins another great battle against the Philistines. Now, again, if you're familiar with the Bible, the Philistines might sound familiar. That is who David battled. That's the giant. He was Goliath of Gath, which was a town in where the Philistines were. So the Philistines were like a common enemy of the nation of Israel. Saul wins a great battle against the Philistines. Now people are like, okay, our king's leading us. He's winning battles. He's doing great things. And as you might imagine, if you were from the lowliest clan, the lowliest tribe of the lowliest clan, nobody thought anything of you. All at once you're the king and you're winning great battles. What might begin to happen? Well, there might be some pride that begins to seep in. Because often, when things haven't gone so well, and then they begin to, often when we haven't had a spotlight and then all of a sudden we get one, well, sometimes our head starts to grow a bit. So he's winning battles, he's doing great things, but there's a problem. Remember, way back in chapter 10, I didn't read it for you, but I mentioned it. As Samuel was giving Saul all of these instructions, he says, go here, do this. Go here and do this. Go here. There's the third location. He says, when you get to Gilgal, wait for me there. And I will come and I will give you further instructions from the Lord. So Saul finally, after winning all these battles, he arrives in Gilgal. But instead of waiting, he waits a little bit. And then Saul gets impatient. And he begins to take matters into his own hands. There's this change that happens inside Saul. He moves from a place of humility, and he begins to shift into like, okay, well, I'll do what God said, but only like mostly. And then whatever makes sense to me, I'll do it from there. So Saul takes matters into his own hands, and he doesn't wait. And then Samuel shows up in 1 Samuel 13. Samuel comes to where they're camped, and Samuel approaches Saul, and he says, what have you done? Saul replies to him, when I saw that the men were scattering, like we've been waiting, the men are getting impatient, the army's getting impatient. And when I saw that they were beginning to scatter and that you didn't come when you said you would, and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, I thought, if I don't do something, the Philistines are going to come down and attack us. And I've not sought the Lord's favor. So I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering. Now let me pause for a moment. Here's what happens. They get to Gilgal. They've got some animals for a sacrifice to the Lord, which was a good thing. It was a good thing that they were going to do. Saul sees that the army is beginning to get impatient. They're beginning to scatter. Like, this is still a new army. They don't have all the discipline in the world. Our enemies are gathering, and if we give them enough time, they're going to come attack us, and we're vulnerable. So I went ahead to gain the Lord's favor. I went ahead and I offered the burnt offering. I offered the sacrifice to the Lord. So Saul, in his mind, says, what I did was a good thing. It was for God. It was for the Lord. But the problem is he had disobeyed the Lord's instructions. And so Samuel looks at him, and he says, you have done a foolish thing. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all of time. This is the first moment in the story of Saul that we really see this like, I got it. I can handle this. God, you put me here. Now I got it. I'm going to do good things. I'm going to do the right things. But if they're not in line with what you led me to, I'm going to do them anyway because I know they're good. And it completely derails Saul. Now, in this moment, Samuel is really foreshadowing what's going to come. He foreshadows the man that God is going to pick next. In fact, the very next verse, which is not, it's verse 14, which I didn't write in your notes, but Samuel continues and he says, God would have established your kingdom for all time, but now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people because you have not kept the Lord's command. That phrase, the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, that's actually quoted in the New Testament. In the book of Acts, Paul is preaching at one point, and Peter, I believe it's Peter preaching, and he quotes this verse, a man after God's own heart. At the time, we don't know who this person is, but it's foreshadowing what's about to come. It's foreshadowing David. Here's why I called this series The GOAT, the greatest of all time. How do you get that title? A man after God's own heart. That's prestigious. Man, if God described me that way, I would be thrilled. That's about as good as it gets. But there's a problem with it. And I'm not going to go deep into this, but I want to mention it now because we're going to spend lots of weeks in David's story. If you're not very familiar with David's story, you may not know this. We celebrate David as being the giant slayer, the one who killed Goliath, the greatest king Israel ever knew. But there was a lot of mess in David's life. Like, maybe you know the story about the time that he saw one of his general's wives. He saw one of his general's wife bathing, and he decided that he wanted her, so he got her and got her pregnant, and then decided to try to cover it up. He killed his general. Well, that doesn't sound like man after God's own heart to me, right? I mean, I've never killed a guy. So, I feel like I'm in better shape than David, right? If you know David's story a bit, you might know that one. You may not know that just a couple years after that happened, one of David's daughters was raped by one of his sons, and then one of his other sons got so angry about it that he killed his brother. Family dysfunction much? I mean, listen, your family might be a train wreck, but my guess is it isn't that big of a train wreck. Or how about the time that one of David's sons decided that he wanted to be the king, and so he split off an entire portion of the nation of Israel and led a rebellion against his dad? Not great. So we see David as this like giant of our faith, and he is, but it's always just captured my imagination that this man who had such a flawed, broken life, God says he's a man after my own heart. Well, how is that the case? And so that's where we're going to go over the next few weeks. We're going to break down David's life and his story in depth and try to figure out, like, what is it that was different about this man who did some terrible things and who had some terrible things happen inside his own family that God went, him. He's one after my heart. Now, so I'm not going to go deep into that, but that's where we're heading. I think there's something different about David. I think there's something fundamentally significant in the depth of who David was. That's why God called him that, and is why I like to think of him as the greatest human of all time. That's not really a thing, by the way, but just had to have a series title. So let's continue for a moment. We're going to get through this. So the next part of the narrative, we meet Saul's son Jonathan, who becomes one of David's very best friends, and Jonathan leads a battle against the Philistines again. They win the battle. There's more great military things happening. But we find now the second example of why things went wrong with Saul. So 1 Samuel chapter 14, the Israelites have won this great battle, and then now they're in distress because Saul had bound the people under an oath, saying, "Cursed be anyone who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies." That was a dumb choice. Anybody, he tells his army, nobody can eat anything until I've gotten my revenge that I want. Well, as you can imagine, the army wasn't super thrilled about this. To make matters worse, Jonathan, his son, doesn't hear this. But the rest of the army does. So the army goes into the woods, continuing with the narrative. The army goes into the woods and they see honey oozing out of some trees. But the whole army's like, we can't do anything. The king said we can't eat. King said we can't eat. Well, Jonathan has been off kind of on his own in this battle, and he doesn't know what the king's orders have been, what his dad's orders have been. So Jonathan gets back, and he immediately grabs some honey and eats it. As you might imagine, This doesn't go over well with the king. And so continuing just a few verses later, in verse 43, Saul's trying to figure out why things aren't going well. And they do this thing again where they cast lots to figure out who's been the one that did something wrong. The lots fall to Jonathan. Saul looks at Jonathan and he says, "What have you done?" And so Jonathan looks at him and he says, I tasted a little honey. It's like, I've got to die now? And Saul looks back at him and he says, "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you do not die, Jonathan." Now, here's what's interesting about this. In this moment, Saul didn't get the instructions to wait on eating from God. It was him. He decided for himself, I don't want anybody to eat until I get my revenge. This wasn't God's instructions to Saul. This was just Saul, again, taking matters into his own hands. Then, when somebody who didn't even know about the instructions, his son, disobeys him, Saul's ready to put him to death. So as you can see, again, going from the man who hid in the boxes to the man who now is ready to kill his son for accidental disobedience, Saul's shifted a long way. Well, the army steps in. They highly respect Jonathan. They like Jonathan. They go to Saul and they're like, "You can't kill him. He didn't even know." So Saul says, okay. He spares Jonathan's life. They win a great battle. Again, more victory. Yay, it's great. Then the nation of Israel is about to go into another battle against the Amalekites. It's like, this is why they wanted a king to lead him in battle, because there's just everybody wants to kill him. So as they get ready to enter battle against the Amalekites, God gives Saul some instructions. And this is where the narrative completely flips. Starting in 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 9. I'm going to read that in a second. The instructions God gives are this: kill everything. Now, there's some problems with that. Like, some people like, kill everything? Yes, God says kill everything. Everyone, everything. Completely obliterate the Amalekites from the face of the earth. Not going to get into why God would have said that. That's a different message for a different day. The point is, God said, do this. Destroy everything. Wipe them off the map. So Saul goes into battle. But look what happens. 1 Samuel 15, starting in verse 9. But Saul and the army, after they win, Saul and the army spared Agag. That's the king of the Amalekites. And they spared the best of the sheep and the cattle, the fat calves and lambs. They spared everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was despised and weak, they totally destroyed. God says, destroy everything. Saul and the army go in, and they spare everything they see as valuable, destroy everything they see as not. So continuing, Samuel was angry when he finds this out, and he cried to the Lord. And the word of the Lord came to Samuel. Sorry, Dave, go back one. That was my fault. The word of the Lord came to Samuel. So God speaks to Samuel. He says, I regret that I've made Saul king. It was the wrong choice, because he's turned away from me, and he won't listen. So Samuel, when he hears this, he's angry, and he cries out to the Lord all night. So early in the morning, Samuel got up and he went to meet Saul. But Saul's left. He's gone to a nearby mountain. There he has set up a monument in his own honor. And he's turned and gone on down to Gilgal. So Samuel goes to Gilgal. And as soon as he gets there, Saul comes out and he says, the Lord bless you. I've done exactly what the Lord asked. And Samuel calls him on it. He says, then why do I hear sheep? What is this lowing of cattle that I hear? Saul answers, the soldiers brought them. Wasn't me. The soldiers brought them from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the sheep to offer to God as a sacrifice. But we destroyed everything else. Why do I hear sheep? The soldiers, they did it. Wasn't me. But now we're going to sacrifice him because God likes sacrifices. Samuel says, enough. Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night. Saul says, tell me, which he regretted in a moment, I promise. Samuel says, although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel. And he sent you on a mission saying, go and destroy these wicked people, the Amalekites, wage war against them until you have wiped them out. Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord? And Saul doubles down on the garbage. He says, but I did obey the Lord. I went on the mission. I completely destroyed the Amalekites. But right away he says, and I brought back Agag, their king. Like he can't even see what he's saying. And then he throws his soldiers under the bus again. The soldiers took sheep and cattle, the best of what was devoted to God, in order to sacrifice them to the Lord your God at Gilgal. Do you see how different Saul has become? Samuel even says it, you were once small in your own eyes. And now all of a sudden, Saul can't even recognize. Like God said, do this. You've done something totally different. But you've got all the best reasons in the world for doing it, don't you? We're so good at this as people. We're so good at when God gives us instructions going, okay, I'll do that, and then doing our own version of it. But not just being obedient. Like just obedient. And then Samuel replies to Saul after he says this again in what is, I think, one of the most, I just find this passage beautiful. Samuel replies, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obedience? To obey is better than sacrifice. To heed, to listen, it's better than the fat of rams. In other words, God doesn't care about your religious performance. He cares about you just doing what he tells you to. He continues, he says, for rebellion is like the sin of divination. In other words, when you just decide you're not going to do what God says, you're playing God. You're pretending you are him. And arrogance, like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. Now, Saul finally realizes how badly he's messed up, and he apologizes. But it's interesting because when he apologizes, he says, hey, I'm so sorry. Can we get a do-over? But when we do the do-over, will you just honor me in front of the people a little bit first? So they know how great a victory I won? Like, buddy. And so we see in Saul this man who initially was hiding in boxes. And now is so desperate, he so deeply craves the approval of the people that he's taken things completely into his own hands, completely forsaken what God has asked. That's the end of chapter 15. And then right as we begin chapter 16, we're introduced to the man after God's own heart. So all this setup, all this, this is the first king. Remember, God said at the beginning, you don't really want a king. The people said, yes, we do. We have this king, he's a good king, but now all of a sudden he's rebellious against God. He won't listen. He won't do what God asks. And when he's confronted with the reality of it, he just makes excuses and blames other people. It's in that context that David enters the scene. Now, I said the backstory matters. If you like superheroes, you know, their origin story is a big deal, right? You got to know where they came from to really understand the character. I wasn't really a superhero guy, but I know enough of them to know, if Bruce Wayne's parents never get murdered, Batman doesn't happen. Right? It's the way it is. If Ben Parker doesn't die, Spider-Man is, he isn't Spider-Man. Right? The origin story matters. The Bible devotes a lot of time to developing out this guy Saul, who in the end God rejects as king. And the reason it spends so much time developing out Saul is because it's a juxtaposition. Saul becomes like the model against which David is brought. This is how to not be a king. But there's someone else. So as we get ready to finish up, I want to show you the moment that we meet David for the very first time. So God sends Samuel to a town called Bethlehem, to a man's house named Jesse. And he says to Samuel, you're going to go to this town in Bethlehem, you're going to go to Jesse's house, and when you do, you're going to find the new king there. I will show him to you. So Jesse goes, and Samuel goes to Jesse, and he says, hey, bring me all your sons. Jesse's like, okay. So he brings them out, lines them up. There's 7 boys there. And 1 Samuel chapter 16, Samuel sees the oldest son, Eliab. And he sees Eliab, and he thinks, surely that's the king. You ever see somebody that you're just like, man, they're impressive? You know? He sees Eliab, and he's like, that's got to be him. He's tall, and he's strong, and he's handsome, and he's king material. Do you remember way back when it said that Saul was taller than anyone else? See, here we're bringing the same theme back. And Saul had been described that way several times in the narrative. I just didn't read them all. He looks at Eliab, and he filters whether or not Eliab is king material through his appearance. But God's like, here's the problem. You're looking at his appearance. You're looking at his height. But don't consider that. Don't consider his appearance or his height, because I've rejected him. That's not the king. And then in one of the more famous verses, if you're familiar with this story, he says, the Lord does not look at the things people look at. We look at what's outside, but the Lord looks at what's inside. You see his height, but I see his heart. Saul was tall. Saul was impressive. That's not gone so well. Remember, I'm picking someone who is after my own heart. And so he continues down the line. It's not Eliab. It's not the next oldest son. It goes all the way down, all 7 sons. And the Lord's like, nope, 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 nope. So he gets to the end and he looks at Jesse and he goes, is this all you got? And Jesse says, well, no, there's one more. But he's out in the fields with our flocks. What kind of complexes might you have if you're that son? Dad, they said to bring all the sons. Did I not count? So Samuel says, get him. Like, Samuel's got to be thinking, I don't know what's going on, but go get that one. So he goes and gets David. And this is the very first moment that we meet who becomes the most developed person in the Bible outside of Jesus. 1 Samuel 16, he sent for him. Jesse sent for David and had him brought in. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, rise and anoint him. This is the one. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully on David. Samuel then went to Ramah. Here's our introduction, the origin story. David, the great king, the fierce warrior who defeats Goliath. His dad didn't even bring him in with his brothers. It wasn't going to be David. David's the runt. He's the little guy. He's the smallest one. We kind of figure that out later as the story goes on. David's not a big dude. He's not very impressive. But his heart is in tune to the heart of God. We're going to end the story here today. We're going to end the story here because there is so much to develop. And all I wanted today was for you to have a picture of this man who maybe you knew all this backstory. But my guess is many of you probably didn't. My guess is for many of you, you never realized that David was the second king of the nation of Israel. The second one. And he was anointed king when there was already a king. And a king who has begun to exhibit behavior that would say that he doesn't really like to be challenged. And that's going to be important as we continue the story next week. As a little bit of a teaser, David actually ends up working for Saul. Saul has no idea he's the next king. David knows, nobody else does. And Saul eventually becomes overcome by madness and does some pretty crazy stuff. That's where we're going to go next week. But for today, the origin of David isn't a story that rises out of a great triumph or out of a lot of successes in life. He was just a shepherd from a family from nowhere. Jesse's family wasn't important. And he becomes the person that is the most important, one of the most important people in the scriptures, aside from Jesus. Typically, I try to be very practical when I preach. This is a very different message. You know, if you've been around, this is a very different message than how I normally preach. But the character development matters so significantly here as we begin to dive into the story of David. Why is David a man after God's own heart? What is it about him that's different? So here's what I want you to do this week. Rather than me giving you like here's a truth and here's an application, which is normally what I do, I hope that maybe just something stuck out to you today. Something that was different, just something, I hope something stuck out. But what I want to do on a practical level is this. On the back of your message notes, there's a reading plan. I don't think we've ever done this before in our church. There's a reading plan. And it's the chapters of this story in 1 Samuel that we covered today. I want you to read it this week. I broke it up into, I think, 4 days? 4 days or 5 days? I think it's 4 days. If you want to break it up more, be my guest. Doesn't matter. I'd like you to read it. Or if you don't like to read, download a Bible app on your phone and listen to it. I don't want you to learn anything. I don't want you to feel like you have to memorize anything at all. I just want you to get the narrative because the narrative matters. It matters a lot. Secondly, I want you to do one other thing. A few weeks back, I preached a message on the Bible, like what the Bible is, and I used kind of a gross analogy about cows chewing their cud. If you missed that message, it was solid. You should listen to it. It was. The Bible is intended to be meditated on. It's intended to just spend time in it and then allow it to make its way into you. It's not really intended for you to read and here's my truth for the day. You might find that, but that's not really the point. Moreover, sometimes the way we approach the Bible is an approach that limits questions, concerns, doubts, and fears. And I think that's actually very counterproductive and very dangerous. And so, again, on the back of your notes, there's a place, what did I put? Questions, concerns, confusions. If you decide to read this week or listen this week, I want you to write down questions that you have about the narrative, concerns you have. Here might be a concern. Why would a good God say to a king, destroy everything in this nation? In some Christian circles, you might be discouraged from asking that question. I do not discourage that. I would encourage that. You might have doubts. You might read it and go, I don't know that I could trust a God that would say something like that. Write that down. Just write it down. Then if you decide to go through with that, find somebody that you trust spiritually and go have a conversation about your concerns and your doubts and the things that don't make sense to you. The things that you're like, whoa, hang on there. Go talk. You might not get all your answers, but there's something very powerful that happens when God's people begin talking about the stuff they struggle with instead of burying it all and pretending that things are great. I've been overwhelmed lately with a couple of people in my life who are deconstructing their faith, and in those cases, most of the deconstruction is coming from a place where they were never allowed to ask questions in their life. They grew up in very conservative backgrounds, and I grew up in a very conservative background, so I understand this. But they got to a place where all these doubts and these things that they just couldn't make sense of got so big that they don't know what to do except for throw their faith away. I don't want that for you. I want you to be able to ask questions. And if you don't have anybody in your life that you trust spiritually enough to ask questions to, my email is andrew@citynorth.church. Send me an email. and I will do my very best to get back to you, which is a little bit of a joke if you've ever emailed me. But I will respond, and we will talk. We can set up a time, we'll chat. Just read the narrative. Write down your thoughts, write down your questions, your concerns, your confusions, and talk to somebody. And then we're going to do the same thing next week. We're going to look at the next part of the story. And we're going to see how this boy begins his ascension to being the greatest king that the nation of Israel has ever known. And the man who now, 3,000 years after his death, has the second most time in the entire Bible devoted to him. It's a fascinating story, and I hope that you will join me again as we continue next week. Okay, for today, I hope you'll take that seriously. I hope you'll just spend time. Again, pressure off. You don't have to learn anything. You don't have to remember anything. You don't have to come away with the truth every day. Just spend time in it. We'll see what happens from there. Okay? Let me pray for us as we finish up. Father, thank you for today. Thank you for your love. Thank you more than anything today that our growth, our nearness to you, our ability to have a healthy, strong, deep relationship with you is not dependent on our ability to interpret and understand the Bible at first glance. But thank you that you've given us such a beautiful library collection of books that tell this great story of how deeply you love us and that show us who we are in relation to you. So God, as we go from here with a very different kind of a service and message and take home today, Father, I ask that you would do some really great things in our lives, that for those of us that decide to take this seriously and spend some time in your word this week, Father, tune our hearts to your voice. Help us to hear what we need to hear. Help us to see what we need to see. God, remove from us any kind of guilt or shame if we don't understand, if we don't feel like we get it all, if we don't feel like it does anything. But God, help us to simply find contentment and peace in knowing that when we are in your word, we're with you. So be with us as we go. Give us your life and give us your love. Help us to be a light into the darkness of the world around us this week. We love you. It's in your name we pray. Amen.